Madam President, earlier this week, I came to the floor to discuss the horrific terror attacks committed by Hamas against Israel on October 7th, the brutal murder of about 1,200 people, and the seizure of 240 hostages. I underscored the fact that Israel not only has the right, but it has the duty to defend itself against those heinous acts and prevent any future October 7th. Never again. I also repeated my calls to prioritize the release of hostages, including American citizens. Madam President, I also pointed out that while Israel is conducting a just war, it must be waged justly, including taking all necessary measures to protect innocent civilians. Last week, Secretary of State Blinken made his 5th trip to Israel, where this time he urged Prime Minister Netanyahu not to launch a major military operation against Rafah, a city in southern Gaza whose population has increased 5-fold since the beginning of the war, because Palestinian refugees fleeing from northern Gaza and other parts of Gaza were told by the Netanyahu government that Rafah was a safe place for them to go. Within hours of meeting with Secretary Blinken, Prime Minister Netanyahu rebuffed that request and announced publicly that he had decided to launch just such an operation against Rafah. And yesterday, as if to rub it in, Prime Minister Netanyahu appeared on ABC Sunday television here in the United States to say that despite the requests from the United States, he had decided that Israel will launch a military operation against the city of Rafah. Madam President, this is part of a pattern where Prime Minister Netanyahu thanks President Biden in the United States for our substantial military assistance, but then mostly rejects our requests to take measures to protect civilians and to facilitate desperately needed humanitarian assistance to people in need. President Biden has called the bombings in Gaza, quote, indiscriminate. And the United States has repeatedly called upon the Netanyahu government to take steps to end the huge number of civilian deaths from bombing, artillery, and other weaponry. The death toll now stands at over 28,000 people, over 2/3 of them women and children. And what does Prime Minister Netanyahu say? He says Israel is already doing all it can. President Biden recently called Israel's actions in Gaza, quote, over the top, unquote. Prime Minister Netanyahu said he didn't know what President Biden was talking about. Every major international aid organization that I've spoken to, and I've spoken to virtually everyone, says that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is the worst they've seen in the world ever in their decades of experience, as over 400,000 people are on the verge of starvation, and the entire population of over 200 million is at crisis levels of food insecurity. Meanwhile, Israeli authorities in Gaza, Kogat, say there's, quote, there's no humanitarian crisis in Gaza, unquote. The Biden administration has repeatedly urged the Netanyahu government to allow for more humanitarian assistance into Gaza, only to be mostly ignored. The overriding message to the United States from the Netanyahu coalition is this: thanks for giving us all the weapons, thanks for your taxpayer support, but don't lecture us about civilian casualties or the need to better facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance. For example, on his trip to Israel last week, Secretary Blinken pointed out that, quote, Israelis were dehumanized in the most horrific way on October 7th, and that the hostages have been dehumanized every day since. I agree. Secretary Blinken then went on to say, but that cannot be a license to dehumanize others, unquote. A former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren, responded by essentially saying, thank you, Secretary Blinken, for the ammunition, but don't accuse Israel of dehumanization, because that delegitimizes Israel and makes it harder for us to use that ammunition or to defend ourselves and exercise our right to self-defense. In other words, former Ambassador Oren was saying, keep sending us the weapons, but don't suggest that we are dehumanizing innocent Palestinians. Madam President, I would suggest that rather than criticizing Secretary Blinken for his comments, Michael Oren and others should condemn the dehumanizing statements about Palestinians that have been made by members of the Netanyahu coalition and other Israeli government officials during the war in Gaza. Here are just some of them. One said, and I quote, "There's no such thing as innocence in Gaza," unquote. Another minister described the campaign in Gaza as, quote, rolling out the Gaza Nakba. Gaza Nakba 2023. Nakba being a reference to the mass displacement of Palestinians back in 1948. And that statement was echoed by other members of Netanyahu's Likud party. Another member of Likud said, and I quote, "There is no place for any humanitarian gestures. We must erase the memory of Amalek," referring to members of a biblical tribe that was an enemy of Israel. In fact, such an enemy that Scripture said the Israelites should put to death every man, woman, and child. Indeed, Prime Minister Netanyahu himself said, and I quote, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you," unquote. A reference scholars say that has long been used on the Israeli far right to justify the inhumane treatment of Palestinians. Even President Herzog, considered by many to be a more moderate voice, painted all Palestinians with a broad brush, saying, and I quote, it's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved. It's absolutely not true. President Herzog. Madam President, these are just a sampling of the many statements made by government officials and Netanyahu coalition members. So what should the United States do? What should we do when bombs and artillery that we have provided and paid for are being used to kill large numbers of innocent Palestinian civilians, and we are told to go mind our own business? What should the United States do when over 2 million Palestinian civilians who have nothing to do with Hamas are facing a humanitarian catastrophe, but the Netanyahu government refuses to open the Eretz crossing or take the other measures that 25 senators wrote to President Biden about last week, asking him to push the Netanyahu government to do them? What should the United States do when the Netanyahu government refuses to prioritize the release of all the remaining hostages, including American citizens? What should we do when extremist settlers in the West Bank, in many cases with the IDF standing by, and in some cases with their active participation, attacks Palestinians with impunity and pushes them off their land? What should we do? What should we do when we have made clear that the United States opposes the launch of a new military operation in the city of Gaza because it will turn into an even bigger humanitarian disaster, but Prime Minister Netanyahu goes on American national TV to say he's going to do it anyway? Rafah is a city in southern Gaza. Before the war started, it was a city with a population of about 300,000 people. Its population has now multiplied in size by 5 times. About 1.3 million people are there now, over 1 million of them having fled death and destruction in other parts of Gaza because they were told by Prime Minister Netanyahu and others that they would be safe there. I visited the Egyptian side of the Rafah Gate about 5 weeks ago, along with my colleague, Senator Merkley, to better understand the humanitarian situation in Gaza. We talked to people, we listened to people, we got fully briefed. Madam President, the humanitarian situation was a catastrophe then. And by all accounts, the situation in Gaza has gone from nightmare to pure hell, even more so in the north than in the south. When asked on national television on Sunday where all of these civilians now seeking refuge would go, Prime Minister Netanyahu breezily stated, "You know, the areas that we've cleared north of Rafah, plenty of areas there." That's what the Prime Minister said on American TV. Now, Madam President, unless he's talking about areas that were cleared through bombing and had been reduced to rubble, it's simply not true. Don't believe those who claim that there's an easy path to caring for the 1.3 million people in Rafah. It wasn't that long ago that Prime Minister Netanyahu claimed that there was no humanitarian crisis in Gaza. No humanitarian crisis there. In fact, he boasted that he was allowing into Gaza the, quote, minimum amount of humanitarian aid to avoid a humanitarian disaster. Well, the claim that there's no humanitarian disaster doesn't pass any credible test, and we know that. For weeks, the United Nations and international aid organizations have warned that Palestinian civilians are on the verge of starvation. Those warnings have been ignored and dismissed by Prime Minister Netanyahu and his extremist government. Just recently, the World Food Program, together with UNICEF, which is the UN organization to look after the well-being of children around the world. Both these organizations, by the way, currently headed by Americans. The WFP and UNICEF issued an analysis recently on the deterioration of the nutrition situation in Gaza during the first 120 days of the war. Here are some of the things that they concluded. In northern Gaza, more than 90% of children aged 6 to 23 months and pregnant and breastfeeding women and girls face severe food poverty. The food they do have is of the lowest nutritional value. More than 90% of children aged 6 to 23 months and more than 95% of pregnant and breastfeeding women and girls are eating 2 or fewer food groups. 95% of households are limiting meals and portion sizes. 64% are only eating 1 meal a day. They indicated that health screenings show a rapid deterioration of the nutrition situation for children aged 6 to 23 months in northern Gaza, with global acute malnutrition at over 15%. WHO, the World Health Organization, classifies global acute malnutrition over 15% as a critical emergency. Madam President, yesterday I began to hear reports of people who have actually starved to death in Gaza. So earlier today, I asked the head of the World Food Program, former American Ambassador Cindy McCain, about these reports. I sent her a note, text message, asking about reports that some children have now crossed the awful threshold from being on the verge of starvation to dying of starvation. She wrote back, and I quote, "This is true. We are unable to get in enough food to keep people from the brink. Famine is imminent. I wish I had better news," end quote. Madam President, I want that to sink in. Kids in Gaza are now dying from the deliberate withholding of food. In addition to the horror of that news, one other thing is true. That is a war crime. It is a textbook war crime. And that makes those who orchestrate it war criminals. So now the question is, what will the United States do? What will we do? What will President Biden do? President Biden must take action in response to what is happening. First and foremost, the president must demand that the Netanyahu government immediately allow more food and water and other life-saving supplies into Gaza and make sure it reaches the children and other people who are starving, including in the north. A few weeks ago, 25 senators wrote the president a letter outlining some of those steps. To my knowledge, none of those 5 steps have been implemented by the Netanyahu government. Second, unless and until the Netanyahu government allows more relief into Gaza, President Biden needs to invoke Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act. Madam President, here's the exact language of that section of the Foreign Assistance Act. Quote, "No assistance shall be furnished under this chapter of the Arms Export Control Act to any country when it is made known to the President that the government of such country prohibits or otherwise restricts, directly or indirectly, the transport or delivery of United States humanitarian assistance." Now, about 3 weeks ago, I asked senior State Department officials to tell me why this law, Section 628I of the Foreign Assistance Act, has not been applied. Tell me how it's not the case that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not restricting directly or indirectly the transport or delivery of United States humanitarian assistance when we have the humanitarian horror show that I just mentioned. Well, I haven't gotten an answer to the question I posed about 3 weeks ago. And the answer, Madam President, is there is no good answer to that question. Now, I applaud the President of the United States for issuing National Security Memorandum number 20 a few days ago. National Security Memorandum number 20, which now has full legal force, is based on an amendment that I and 18 of my fellow senators filed on this national security bill that we're considering right now. And I want to thank the President and his team for putting the terms of that amendment into action, into law through the National Security Memorandum, which gives the President of the United States additional tools to require that countries, all countries, that receive and use our military assistance do so in accordance with international humanitarian law. In fact, here's the wording of the National Security Memorandum, which is now the law of the land. Quote, "The Secretary of State shall obtain credible and reliable written assurances from a representative of the recipient country, as the Secretary of State deems appropriate, that in any area of armed conflict where such recipient country uses such defense articles consistent with applicable law, the recipient country will facilitate and not arbitrarily deny, restrict, or otherwise impede, directly or indirectly, the transport or delivery of United States humanitarian assistance and United States government-supported international efforts to provide humanitarian assistance. That is now the law of the land. Madam President, the bill before us does a number of things. It provides military assistance to Ukraine, to Israel, to our partners in the Indo-Pacific. It also contains life-saving humanitarian aid that, if it can actually be delivered to those who need it, would save lives in Gaza, the West Bank, Sudan, and other places around the world facing desperate humanitarian situations. As I've said before on this floor, I am supporting this bill because of the vital military assistance it provides to the people of Ukraine. And I will vote for it because without that assistance, they will not be able to sustain their courageous effort to fight off the onslaught against their democracy and their sovereignty from Vladimir Putin. And I support the vital humanitarian assistance in this bill. And I fully support the funds to supply Israel with the Iron Dome system and other defensive systems that have been essential to protect the people of Israel from Hamas rocket attacks and are there to protect them from other incoming missiles. With respect to the lethal offensive portion of that assistance, I'm asking President Biden to make sure that it is provided in strict adherence to National Security Memorandum 20 that he just issued, and be used only in accordance with international humanitarian law. That memorandum provides the President with substantial new leverage to make that happen if he chooses to use it. I hope he will, because the United States government has an obligation on behalf of the American people to make sure that our military support aligns with our values and interests. There should be no blank checks for any country. We cannot continue the pattern where Prime Minister Netanyahu says, "Thank you, Mr. President, for America's generous military assistance," and then thumbs his nose at America's legitimate requests. Madam President, this is a hinge moment in history with what's going on right now in Ukraine. But it's also a critical question for our country with respect to what's going on in Gaza. And I hope and I pray that the President of the United States will make sure that the United States conducts itself in a manner that is consistent with our values and with our interests. I yield the floor.